Evening had begun to fall. The sun was sinking low against the horizon, and the golden light stretched across the empty plains of the American West. The tall grass swayed gently, the wind whistled through the dry land, and silence hung like a blanket over everything. Sometimes, the only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of a horse's hooves against the earth. On that lonely trail rode Jack Turner, a cowboy whose face carried the weight of 100 silent sunsets. For years, Jack had ridden the same paths. He had no one waiting for him, no one to visit. His life was a quiet pattern, herding cattle, chopping wood, spending nights alone beneath a sky filled with stars. Once, long ago, he'd had a wife, and a baby on the way. But a storm had taken them both. Since that day, Jack's heart had turned to stone. But that evening, fate had other plans. As his horse trudged along the familiar trail, a sound rose above the whispering wind, faint, soft, almost unreal. Jack froze. He listened. The wind carried it again, a weak cry. And then he heard it clearly, a small, trembling voice calling out, "Mama." Jack's blood ran cold. Out here, miles from the nearest town, where only ghosts and coyotes roamed, a child's voice. That couldn't be. He dismounted, scanning the empty grasslands. There was nothing, only dust and dying sunlight. But then, the sound came again, closer this time. Jack followed it, heart pounding. And then he saw it, an old burlap sack tangled among the weeds. It moved. Jack dropped to his knees, tore open the rough knot, and froze. Inside was a baby. A little girl, barely a year old, her face streaked with tears and dirt, trembling in the cold. Her lips quivered as she whispered again, "Mama," and then fell silent. Jack's throat tightened. "Dear God," he breathed. Who could do this? The child was barely breathing. Without thinking, Jack wrapped her in his jacket, mounted his horse, and rode hard toward his cabin. The sun disappeared behind the hills, the sky turned red, and the wind screamed in his ears. The trail blurred beneath him, but Jack didn't care. He held the tiny bundle close, as if protecting the last spark of life on earth. When he reached his cabin, he burst through the door, lit a fire, and warmed water. The baby was ice cold. He wrapped her in a wool blanket and held her near the fire until her tiny fingers began to move. Her eyes fluttered open, frightened, but alive. Jack fed her a little milk he had in the kitchen, and slowly, her cries faded. Then something happened that struck him deeper than he expected. Her tiny hand reached out and wrapped around his thumb. And in that single moment, Jack Turner felt his heart beat again. That night, the wind howled outside, but inside, warmth flickered from the fire. Jack sat watching the child as she slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling with every breath. She smiled in her sleep. And for the first time in years, Jack smiled too. The next morning, he saddled up and rode into town with the baby in his arms. People stopped and stared. "Jack, what in the world?" the shopkeeper asked. "Found her out in the valley," Jack said quietly. "In a sack. Still alive." Word spread quickly. Within the hour, Sheriff Daniels came to see him. When he looked at the baby, his expression changed. "Jack, this little one, she's from the Thompson family. Their wagon was attacked by bandits last week. Her parents didn't make it." Jack's heart sank. He looked down at the baby, who was now reaching for his hat with her tiny fingers. She had survived something no child should ever face. Over the next few days, Jack cared for her himself. He named her Grace, because she was, to him, a miracle. He built a small crib out of old wood, made milk bottles from spare flasks, and learned to soothe her when she cried. He took her everywhere, to the riverbanks, to the fields where the horses grazed, to the tall cliffs where sunsets painted the world in gold. Grace laughed often, and her laughter filled the cabin with life again. At night, when the fire crackled and the moonlight poured through the window, Grace would rest her tiny head on his chest and mumble the only word she seemed to know, Mama. Jack would stroke her hair gently and whisper, "Sleep, little one." But deep down, every time she said that word, something inside him healed a little more. Months passed. Grace learned to crawl, then to walk, and the cabin that once echoed with silence now rang with her giggles. Jack's neighbors often stopped by, surprised to see the tough old cowboy with a child in his arms. But no one dared joke about it, they could see the light she had brought into his eyes. One afternoon, Jack took Grace back to the place where he had found her. The wind was calm, the grass swaying gently. He pointed to the patch of ground and said softly, "This is where your life began again, Grace." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide and innocent. "Was it God who sent you, Papa?" she asked. Jack's throat tightened. He smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe he sent you to me, too." Years rolled on. Grace grew taller, stronger, and braver, a wild, free spirit like the wind itself. And Jack Turner, once a broken man, had become whole again. People in town often spoke of him differently now. They no longer called him the lonely cowboy. They called him the man who found life in the dust. One evening, as the sun dipped low again over the same horizon, Grace, now a bright young girl, asked, "Papa, what would have happened if you hadn't heard me that day?" Jack smiled and looked toward the fading light. "Then maybe my life would never have begun, Grace," he said softly. She ran into his arms, and he held her close, feeling the same warmth he had felt on that first night by the fire. Sometimes, life doesn't give us what we want. It gives us what we need. For Jack Turner, that need came in the form of a faint, trembling voice carried by the wind, a single word that had changed everything. Mama. And that voice, that fragile, miraculous voice, had not only saved a child's life, it had saved his own.